All right, let's get started while we're waiting for some people to trickle in still. All right, so just looking at our syllabus, we'll be doing the final selection from Kant's Critique of Judgement next week. And you'll see that there are kind of the main readings, and then there's the bracketed readings, meaning we're going to read the last part of the main body of the text and discuss that, but you might also, if you are so inclined, look at the appendix, which is another almost 100 pages, because there he's really just talking about the implications of the argument. Right? So he sort of finishes the argument with the third part, but then he gets into some further considerations, elaborations, and implications that are illustrative. We might make some reference to them. And that will finish out our Kant, but we will have actually the opportunity to review some aspects of Kant with the subsequent reading from Schiller, because Schiller, the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, is very explicitly trying to follow directly upon Kant's Critique of Judgement. And as I mentioned to you guys, starting with Schiller, the readings are going to become more discursive for a while, meaning both the Schiller and the Hegel won't have the kind of more arch, logical, schematic type language that Kant has. It'll be much more discursive, even conversational. The Hegel that we're reading is lectures, so it'll be more comprehensible that way. So to wit, who would like to volunteer for the last section of Kant to be my two presenter volunteers? Recall that we'll be kind of completing the argument in terms of how he's building. So last week we dealt with the aesthetic judgment of beautiful objects. This week we're dealing with the aesthetic judgment of sublime forces. And next week we'll be dealing with the aesthetic judgment of teleological beings. Anyone want to deal with beings? Who are my presenters this week? Yeah, great. Okay, great. Remember your name?
Andrew.
Andrew, great, thank you. I have one other. Don't keep your powder dry too long, children. You're getting rolling in the course now. So everyone will present twice over the course of the semester. Do you know what keeping your powder dry means? No. It's like saving the fight. It's like, it's from the old era of muskets. It's appropriate to Kant's time, where you literally had to have a little bag of gunpowder that you put in the gun. So you have to keep it dry, otherwise it won't really work. You're saving the fight for later. Or are you just scared? Okay, Mark. You want to.
I really didn't want to do Kant, but
the reason that you want to and that you need to,
I would love,
is that the third part's gonna wipe out Deleuze.
Yeah, we'll see.
It's gonna wipe out Spinoza and Deleuze. It's gonna take care of all that shit. All right. I'm here to give you what you want. Not what you want, what you need. Remember. Okay, so what I'd like to do, I'm going to modulate things a bit in between last week's discussion and this week's discussion with a little bit of Baudelaire. So Baudelaire, who has come up in the first week, mentioned, and I mentioned that there are two sort of absent presences on our syllabus, Marx and Baudelaire. But we will dip into them nonetheless. So Marx will show up when we get to the Adorno, And Baudelaire's going to start showing up really with Nietzsche. He's going to be sort of haunting the background. But I thought I'd bring him in now with respect to this transition from the beautiful to the sublime, and also the question of modernism. So we're getting a kind of a sneak peek at modernism, even though Kant's not really dealing with modernism. Kant's not even dealing with romanticism. He's dealing really with classicism. I think that, have we done a sort of a little timeline on this yet? Have we done any timelines in this course yet? Okay, so actually, I think we need to do that anyway, because of the way Kant invokes the sublime with respect to society. He says that society is sublime, the law is sublime. These are some phenomena for Kant. All right, so yeah, we'll anticipate something. Okay, so the revolutions, so the American and French revolutions. It's our first sort of date to plot our thinkers on. So Kant is coming between the American and French revolutions. We will see that Hegel and Schiller are going to be coming during and in the aftermath of the French Revolution. So Schiller will be reading from 1794 from the Jacobin Terror during the French Revolution, which is holding the world spellbound. Everybody's like, what the hell's going on? And he's like, how could I write about art when this crazy political stuff is going on? Well, let me tell you why. And he thinks that art and aesthetics will help the political situation. So they're always thinking about philosophy and politics, all of them, including Kant. So I mentioned that he's really thinking about art and aesthetics more generally in what we might broadly consider to be the terms of classicism. And we could say also that we could use that as a rough framework for thinking about bourgeois aesthetics, modern aesthetics, meaning coming out of the Renaissance, and certainly the aesthetic thinking of the Enlightenment. So Diderot, Rameau's nephew, there are some major aesthetic and philosophy of art that's going on before Kant's time. And in the Enlightenment, generally, it's got two phases. The 17th and 18th centuries, the 1600s and the 1700s. So I mentioned Spinoza. So Descartes and Spinoza, and of course there are others, Hobbes, Enlightenment thinkers of the 1600s. And then there's the Enlightenment of the 1700s, and Kant and Hegel, Kant, Schiller, Hegel, German idealism is coming at the end of the Enlightenment. And we will actually see what Nietzsche has to say about that. Meaning they could be seen as the culmination of the Enlightenment, or they could be seen as the betrayal of the Enlightenment. Kant and Hegel. That's what Nietzsche thought. Betrayal of the Enlightenment. Okay, so why that kind of ambiguity? Well, there is an important turn that takes place starting already in Kant's time, but more explicitly with Schiller, and then thematized philosophically by Hegel, Romanticism. So there's a crisis of classicism that's expressed in Romanticism. And Romanticism is associated with, but not identical to, there are overlaps, but not to be rendered identical, between Romanticism and the Counter-Enlightenment. So classicism is associated with the Enlightenment. Romanticism can also in certain respects be associated with, even though not equivalent to, the counter-enlightenment. And of course, counter-enlightenment suggests counter-revolution. Counter-revolution, right? The counter-revolution. So in the context of the French Revolution, the counter-revolution. The conservative reactionaries. Right? Because in many respects, the American and French revolutions are seen as the product of the Enlightenment. And then there's counter-revolution and counter-enlightenment. Romanticism has some association with them without being reducible to it, especially because many of the romantics are, in fact, in their sentiments, revolutionary. They're really partisans of revolution. Okay, now Romanticism, I could say, we've never quite left the Romantic era. So in the first week of class, we read Robert Pippin, and he talked about the romantic recoil at modernity. The romantic recoil at modernity, which he dated starting with Rousseau. Rousseau, who is a foundational figure for Kant and Schiller and Hegel. We'll see Schiller's epigraph for the letters on the aesthetic education of man is Rousseau. Right? So German idealist philosophy. And then Romanticism as a kind of historical, kind of art movement, we might say, does trace back to Rousseau. Romantic recoil at modernity, meaning some critical attitude about modernity. The critique of modernity. Now, I mentioned that, and Pippin, you'll remember, said postmodernism was another repetition of this romantic recoil of modernity. So I date the French Revolution the way I do because it's the whole cycle. It's including the Napoleonic era, including the return of Napoleon for the 100 Days in 1815 before he's finally defeated at Waterloo. And so there is a restoration monarchy. Starts in 1814, but then is solidified after 1815. And then there is another revolution in France, but with resonance throughout the world, throughout Europe certainly, throughout the world. And that's the July Revolution of 1830. And associated with that, liberty leading the people, Delacroix. So Delacroix is a romantic painter. However, he's also among the first realist painters. So circa 1830, we have the phenomenon of realism. We have literary realism, we have realism in the visual arts, in painting and sculpture, realism as a kind of a value, and also a contested value. What's realism? Realism, it's not equivalent to naturalism. What is it? And in many respects, so Delacroix is a romantic painter who becomes a realist painter. Romanticism issues into realism. Again, realism versus naturalism. What is invented in the 1830s? Photography. And how do we understand photography with regard to the history of art? What kind of sensibility does photography partake of? Realism, of course, realism. But also is sort of shadowed by the question of naturalism, meaning is photography not art because it's too naturalistic and maybe is not realistic enough? Okay. So we go forward, 1848. So you'll also recall from the Robert Pippin from the first week, he said, coming into view by the middle of the 1800s, by the middle of the 19th century, a consensus was building in European high culture that the new comprehensive form of life, capitalism, was unaffirmable, pathological, even certainly ugly. Okay. That's the birth of modernism. And again, Pippin gave us some other language for thinking about that. Modernist dissatisfaction. Modernist dissatisfaction. All right, so we have kind of two things. We have repetition of the romantic recoil at modernity. We also have the repetition of modernist dissatisfaction. And he described it as art being about the end of art taking itself as its own subject. In literary modernism, he calls it bourgeois self-hatred as foundational for the modernist novel, and that we're still in that mode all the way up to the present. French bourgeois self-hatred. Right, so how long can art be about the end of art? How long can art take itself as its subject? How long can art be about something that has its canonical instantiation in French bourgeois self-hatred?
Is that the era of like death of the poet, death of the author, death of the self?
That's later. That would be more postmodernism, but I'm not sure. What do you mean by that?
Like art being about itself and talking about itself in the context of art history. So it's like kind of demonstrating the same sentiment.
Right, so that would raise the question of, right, what art taking itself as its subject would mean. Because it wouldn't necessarily mean like the artist as subject, it would be art as the subject. You could say that maybe Romanticism is about the artist as subject, and modernism is about art itself as subject, and so it's the introduction of a certain kind of inhumanity into art, and that's exactly what we're going to get into with Baudelaire. So yes, maybe, but in a kind of curious way, because the question is it registered as such? It's really in the 20th century that people start talking that way, about formalism, right? So the issue of modernism is not contested around the question of formalism until the 20th century. For what it's worth. Okay. So modernism, and we did talk about this in the first week of class, I think. Not sure though. So modernism is something that is established by Baudelaire, because he coins the term modernity. He doesn't use the term modernism, but both his criticism and his own literary work, his own literary art, are seen as the beginning of modernism. Okay. And then we have basically the 20th century, what we'll get to later in the course, but we should be aware of now. This sort of strange coexistence and antagonism between realism and modernism. Both of which are outgrowths of Romanticism. So in many respects, realism remains Romanticism and modernism remains Romanticism. Modernism remains Romanticism because where Romanticism is maybe articulating a loss, a sense of loss of the canon, a loss of the classical, a detachment from, like the loss of touch with, a lack of fluency in the classical, the canonical. What Romanticism sees as a loss, modernism via Baudelaire sees as a gain, puts a positive value on what is otherwise seen as a negative value. And then there's a question of whether modernism seeks to establish a new canon, a new classicism. So there's a kind of paradox of like modernist classics. Are there modernist classics? And what would that mean? Okay. So we usually don't talk about it this way, but in this course, it's going to be important for us to talk about it this way. The birth of modernism, circa 1848. Usually modernism is projected into the 20th century because the 60s generation that really established the culture we live in now, they think that they discovered everything. They discovered sex, they discovered music, right? They invented everything and nothing really happened before them. No, of course that's not true. So they rebelled, postmodernism was that generation's rebellion against institutionalized modernism, like MoMA modernism. So the idea was modernism was just yesterday, and then we're postmodern rebels against it. No. Modernism is way back. Okay, so let's go forward a little bit just so that you have the full timeline. Of course, 1848, I mentioned Baudelaire, also Marx. Marx is modernism in politics, Baudelaire is modernism in art and literature. So one of the supplemental readings that I had included on the syllabus is Clement Greenberg's Avant-Garde Kitsch. It talks about the relationship between the political avant-garde and the artistic avant-garde, and how they start out together but then depart from each other, but then they still have this kind of relationship to each other. So the artistic avant-garde leaves the realm of politics, but still has some similarities to the political avant-garde, and the political avant-garde is Marx. That's Marxism. That's the vanguard, avant-garde, the political avant-garde. And he calls both political modernism, because he uses the term the way people in the 1800s would have used the terms synonymously, avant-garde and modernist are the same. It's not the 20th century avant-garde yet. Both the political modernism and artistic modernism, the political avant-garde and the artistic avant-garde, are characterized by a superior consciousness of history. Superior consciousness of history. Now, when does this more historical sense of things happen, however? It happens with Romanticism. Romanticism is the first real, deep consciousness of history, historical difference, the nuances of historical change. It's very different from a classical notion of history. Classical notion of history is a notion that we just build upon a canon, and the canon gets more and more developed, and it gets more and more capacious, and it gets broader, wider. It can include everything, so that in the Enlightenment, the idea is that non-Western culture can still be understood as part of the same story as Western history. So the kind of humanistic ethos that everything sort of builds together across human history. That's very different from thinking about, meaning nothing, the phrase is actually from the late Roman era, nothing human is alien to me. Nothing human is alien to me. Nothing human is alien to me, meaning there is such a thing as universal history, universal art history, including. Right, so there's a history of art going all the way back to the cave paintings. It's all one thing. So that's a certain sense of history, but it comes with the sense of loss. Like we become sort of detached from that history, and now we're kind of floating in this kind of weird time and space of loss of connection with not only Western history, but with all human history, right? But anyway, different notion of the sense of history with Marx and Baudelaire, because it's the idea of a task. Right, the task, what's the task of history? Task of history. What should we do? What is to be done, as Lenin put it? What's the task that we have? And that's modernism, meaning the task of being true to the modern era, modernity, capitalism. So that's another parallel timeline. What do we have here? And that's capitalism as Marxism described it, or as Marx described it, and Marxism following it. So that's the Industrial Revolution. So the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production that comes with the Industrial Revolution, that's capitalism. So there's some consciousness of capitalism that's happening in the 1840s. Crisis of capitalism in the 1840s. It's the hungry 1840s, first worldwide Great Depression after the Industrial Revolution. It's the rise of the industrial proletariat as a revolutionary political and social force. Marx comes of age in the 40s. He and Engels are in their 20s in the 40s. So the big fact of their time is this worldwide crisis of capitalism and a new social and political movement that didn't exist before. Proletarian socialism. So the task that they thought was being revealed was socialism or communism. Capitalism is the task to transcend and achieve that. So that's another, and we could see from 1750 to 1850 that there's a kind of dawning consciousness of historical modernity that's taking place. All right, so the next period that's important is this period from 1848 to 1871. So from the revolutions of 1848 the spring of the peoples, or the spring of the nations. Where we get the term Arab Spring from. So in France and Germany there are revolutions. There's also an uprising in Vienna, there are things going on in Italy, really throughout Europe. Which Marx thought the task of that revolution was communism, to achieve communism. Of course, that didn't happen. Actually, these revolutions failed in a way that was not true in 1830 with the July Revolution, nor with the American and French revolutions. All right, and that period, in the aftermath of 1848, we'll get to later, it's the period of Baudelaire and Marx's big kind of intellectual breakthroughs. In the period after 1870-71, after the Franco-Prussian War and after the Paris Commune that comes at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, but also other events that take place roughly contemporaneously. Now I'm forgetting the exact date. So there's the US Civil War, huge worldwide significant event. And I think it's 1870, the Meiji Restoration, which is the defeat of the samurai by the emperor in Japan. Why is that all important? The Prussian victory over the French in the Franco-Prussian War allows for German unification under the Prussian Empire. The US Civil War, of course, unifies the United States politically in a new way. The Meiji Restoration also unifies Japan. It allows for the rapid industrialization of these countries. And the period between that time and World War I is the Second Industrial Revolution. And that's also the period of, so it's called in French, it's called the Belle Epoque. Third Republic, France. It's called in the United States and also the Anglophone world more generally the Gilded Age. It's the period of the Second Industrial Revolution, rapid industrialization, new technological breakthroughs. This is the period of high modernism. So high modernism meaning Impressionism, all the sort of isms that you get. But building up to 1913 Armory Show in New York, which is the big sort of exhibit of like modernism in New York that culminates this history. So high modernism, right before World War One. However, World War One is a crisis of that modernism, and World War One and the revolutions that follow Russia, Germany, Hungary, Italy, these revolutions at the end of World War I. There's also the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. We're still dealing with the political aftermath of World War I, in case you didn't know. Palestine, Ukraine, end of World War I. The crisis of these big empires, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire. German Empire, Germany also had a thing because Prussia was part of Poland, and anyway. The crisis of World War I in the realm of art can be seen in the emergence of the 20th century avant-garde. But also mass culture in a new and different way. It emerged in the 19th century, but it intensifies. Also, political art. So art that has explicit political kind of movement associations, like fascist art, liberal democratic art, communist art. And late modernism. So if you know your art history, Picasso before World War I versus Picasso after World War I. Late modernism as opposed to high modernism. We could also say postmodernism. Especially because postmodernism is associated very strongly with the 20th century avant-garde, with Dada and Surrealism, for example. Right. But then postmodernism is recognized as such only later, after World War II, in architecture first, and then in the broader kind of visual art and literary world in the late 60s and 70s. You start to get a sense of postmodernism. But they hark back to the earlier 20th century and the 20th century avant-garde as kind of canonical for postmodernism. Okay, so all of that, this will, so we will then, the Second Industrial Revolution era of high modernism, our thinker there is going to be Nietzsche. Wagner, by the way, is the first modernist in music. And we'll see what role Wagner has to play for Nietzsche, who was a musician. Then we'll be reading Lukács. Towards the end of that period, he's dealing with literary modernism and the theory of the novel. Dostoevsky is his exemplar of this. Of a kind of high modernism and even like a crisis of modernism already manifesting. And then Adorno will be the last thinker that we have who comes after this period, after the World War I revolutionary crisis. Although we'll be reading him kind of much later. We'll pick up Adorno in the 50s, in the 1950s, and then aesthetic theory in the 1960s. So Adorno will actually be thinking, without the term being available exactly, the postmodernism. If you think about late modernism and postmodernism. And also the repetition of this relationship between realism and modernism in the 20th century, because the communist movement adopts socialist realism as the official aesthetics against modernism. Modernism is condemned as bourgeois decadence, and socialist realism is instantiated as the official aesthetic of proletarian socialism. And we'll see that Adorno is responding to that. that mid-20th century pitting of socialist realism against modernism, where the United States and the West championed modernism as expressing freedom, and the East, the communist East, championed socialist realism against that. Mm-hmm.
So like I'm completely following the way that kind of like using the terms, but isn't it also possible to articulate sort of like socialist realism and even like Nazi, fascist art?
Mm-hmm.
It's like still modernism, like
Kitsch. It's kitsch modernism. According to Clement Greenberg and avant-garde and kitsch and avant-garde are two kinds of modernism. There's like kind of cutting-edge modernism, and then there's rearguard modernism. And kitsch is rearguard modernism. So they're both modernist, but one has the superior consciousness of history, and the other tries to produce a kind of timeless aesthetic. So the avant-garde is characterized by its evanescence, meaning art is only avant-garde in its moment, and then it becomes kitschified because it becomes museumified, becomes Alexandrianized, like the Library at Alexandria. It becomes this dead thing, that you go to a museum to see. It's not part of living social life anymore, whereas kitsch remains part of living social life, but at the cost of a kind of lobotomy of its historical consciousness. Yeah, so definitely Greenberg, for example, saw socialist realism, fascist aesthetics, liberal democratic aesthetics, New Deal art, like Works Progress Administration, WPA art, as kitsch.
Right, but so like the Greenbergian view is kind of still like making that distinction from the way I'm trying to say it within modernism.
Uh-huh.
I'm thinking more from like a postmodern perspective.
Right.
Seeing modernism, seeing the end of modernism, not so much as this like end of modernism vis-a-vis Picasso, etc., but rather as like the collapse of these historical meta-narratives, Holocaust, these kinds of things, sort of these historical markers.
Yeah, because modernism is seen as totalitarianism.
Right.
Yeah.
So in that sense,
Uh-huh.
like social realism is still firmly like capital N modernism. And
It is, but affirmative rather than critical. Right, so here would be a distinction that's worth making. So the grand narrative, if you remember Robert Pittman, his piece, he said the now tired issue of grand narratives. He wrote that in 2003. And I wish that we were done with the discontent with grand narratives, because we got to deal with the grand narrative of history. In other words, we're humans on this spaceship Earth, hurtling to our doom. We're in one boat. We are. So there is a grand narrative, namely the world has been unified. That's been going on for hundreds of years. Our fate is unified. It is. So we got to deal with the totality. The question is, what's the nature of that totality? Is the totality to be affirmed, or is the totality to be critiqued? Right? So there is a totality, capitalism. We're all in that. The fate of humanity is tied to the fate of capitalism. But it's a negative totality. It's a critical totality. It's a problematic totality. But it is a totality, meaning all of humanity is tasked with one thing, overcoming capitalism. It is. Whether it knows it or not, it is. Anyway, remember I'm the advocate. I'm the defense attorney. I'm voicing, right? So I'm voicing Adorno now. But also Lukács, but after the Lukács that we read, the Marxist Lukács. So totality. Now, the problem being, Stalinism affirms the totality in a curious way. It affirms the totality. Even though it's nominally anti-capitalist, it's still the adjustment of the communist movement to the reality of capitalism. And we have that all the way up to China today, which is taking the capitalist road to socialism. What's the difference between taking the capitalist road to socialism and the capitalist road to capitalism? Meaning, from a Marxist perspective, the United States is on a capitalist road to socialism because capitalism leads to socialism. That's the grand narrative, isn't it? So it's not like you have to choose to take the capitalist path to socialism. It is the case. Capitalism is on the path to socialism or barbarism, socialism or barbarism. These are sweeping, grand, totalizing statements, definitely. Huh?
Or extinction.
Extinction is optimistic. Extinction is optimistic. There are going to be humans. The only question is how miserable they're going to be.
Yeah.
But there are going to be humans.
System extinction, I guess. I mean, not like every last person dying, but like capitalism.
We'll reproduce capitalism even after the nuclear annihilation, because that's the only thing that we have, right? Like it's the social relations that we'll take into post-apocalyptic survival. Guess what? We're already living in a post-apocalyptic world. We are. We might choose to forget that we are, but we are. Look got me into trouble last time when I said we already live in a post-nuclear Holocaust world. We do. We do. Right? It's happened. It's in the past. We're not waiting for it to happen. It happened. Again, Adorno, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. But to try to prevent the writing of poetry after Auschwitz would also be barbaric. And the barbarism comes from our inability to see that it is barbaric, that we carry on. Right? Or as Beckett put it, I can't go on, I'll go on. You know, Samuel Beckett, playwright, he'll make an appearance in the Adorno that we read. So yes, so postmodernism wanted to get off the train. Right? Postmodernism was like, we don't want to be on this capitalism, socialism train. No. We want to kind of retreat into the nooks and crannies of history and disintegrate universal history. And people are different. They're not all part of this capitalism, socialism problem. Right?
Yeah, I mean, but some of for you guys. I mean, like part of the problem is the universalizing tendency. Because, like, of course, I agree. Like, the world is smothered in capitalism from like pole to pole. But at the same time, you know, there's kind of some blind spots in this cosmology. Like, for instance, it's kind of strange that Adorno refuses to write poetry after the Holocaust, but he's perfectly happy to write poetry after like the indigenous genocide in North America. So, like, for him.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's inconsistency in this kind of like homogenization of history.
Yeah. Maybe. You'd have to distinguish between different moments of that. Because that's not all one thing. Right? So there's the catastrophe of exposure to disease from the Eastern Hemisphere that occurs in the Western Hemisphere. Then there's, of course, colonialism. Then, of course, there's the late 1800s, and that's when the real exterminationist policies, meaning solidly in the era of capitalism, is when you get a kind of exterminationism. It's different. Solidly in the era of capitalism. After the Civil War is when that shit happens. Now, of course, there are other problems, right? There's the dual problems of the emergence of the bourgeois era. There's colonialism, mostly with respect to the Western world, but then later in other parts of the world. And then there's slavery. There's the transatlantic African slavery that's bound up in the emergence of bourgeois society as well. So that's before capitalism. It's before capitalism. It seems to be part of the history of capitalism, but it's also before capitalism. It's before this industrial era. The big distinction that Adorno would make, or any Marxist would make, is that in that time, in the time of Columbian contact, Western Hemisphere colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, socialism was not possible yet. Socialism was not possible yet. That was not the task. The task was bourgeois emancipation. The task was liberty, equality, fraternity, all with equal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was the task. That might still be the task in certain respects, but then there's another thing. Capitalism and socialism. So socialism was not possible before the Industrial Revolution. And we don't have modernism in art before the Industrial Revolution. So why is that? Are all these just accidental things? Right? Again, as advocate, I would say, in a typical Marxist way, it's not accidental that these things happen at the same time. that we get a bizarre crisis of bourgeois culture at the same time that we have the emergence of a demand for socialism, which you don't have before the middle of the 1800s. You don't have it. All right, so there is some connection here. There's some connection. And that's what we're exploring, meaning modernism. Modernism, philosophy of modernism. That's the course, philosophy of modernism. Postmodernism, there is a guy that I teach, or do I teach him? No, I teach Paul Ricoeur. I don't teach Bruno Latour. We were never modern. Yeah, we were never modern, except, hello, we're blowing up the earth in a way that wasn't possible before. So what do you mean we're never modern? Right? We were never modern, but wait, we're dealing with problems that they weren't dealing with in the Middle Ages. So it might sound nice to say we never left the Middle Ages, but we did. We did. We're dealing with new and different problems. We're dealing with the crisis of humanism. And humanism didn't exist in the Middle Ages. We could say, oh, the crisis of humanism means humanism never happened. No, it did happen, and it still is happening. We still have humanism. We still do.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How can we possibly understand history as a whole happening to everyone when, like, in theory that makes sense because obviously things are happening to everyone at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But in the understanding of it is impossible as a whole because of our own perspectives of history. So how can we, like, abandon our own perspective in order to understand someone else's and then still understand our own? Like, how can those two?
I would say that we do understand history universally.
But isn't it infinite? Like, the amount of perspectives are infinite. So how can we possibly understand it as a whole?
As a problem and a task. So what's the term that the global warming movement has? Anthropocene.
Yeah.
Do you know when the Anthropocene starts? With the Industrial Revolution. Anthropocene is just another term for capitalism. So a geological epoch, like understood in those terms, understood as an event in natural history. The Industrial Revolution is still seen as central, crucial, and the fate of the planet, meaning all the people on it. So you can give it other names. It's capitalism.
But like the task, in order for the task to be accomplished, sometimes to understand it as a whole, everyone would have to be equal. And that's not true in history.
Right.
For example, like fraternité in France, like that is a pursuit, a task.
Mm-hmm,
But in order to pursue that task, people were taken advantage of in other cultures for that to be accomplished. That wasn't told in the history of France. That was kind of obscure. So but both of those happened at the same time.
Yeah, that would involve collapsing some history. It would, meaning that would lose us some important drama, meaning the counter-revolution, the new revolutions, the failure of the new revolution, like the Second Empire, right? So there was a Napoleonic Empire that betrayed the Haitian Revolution, but then there's the Second Empire, which involves like colonization in a new way. And it's very tricky, right? So there's a lot of Sturm und Drang, to use a romantic term, into this history. It's not like uniform or linear. It isn't. But nonetheless, the task hangs over it. And the other difference is like the ruling class and the ruling ideas. And I mean, there's, like when Spain and Portugal colonized the New World, they are ruled by a feudal aristocracy and absolute monarchies And they do so in the name of Christianity, and they do so in the name of expanding their empires, and they give like land to aristocrats to govern in a kind of strangely kind of post-Roman way, where it's like, you know, you have the right to rule the people there and send tribute back to the mother country. That's not liberty, equality, fraternity. That's not. The French Revolution is a revolution against that. The American Revolution is a revolution against that. It's against that. That's the whole point. So, again, there is a case to be made for what's new and different in this era, in this specific era that we're talking about. The last 250 years, I guess it's going to be 250 years next year, 1776, 250 years, right? So, yeah, I mean, the 19th century is very fraught. 19th century is very fraught, meaning it is about this contradiction. It's about this contradiction. And again, there is a way of thinking about that we'll get to, because we're going to, like I said, Nietzsche's not a Marxist at all. But he's going to register a world historic crisis. Right? So, and he's not aware of Marxism, really. He's aware of socialism, though, big time, because Wagner was a socialist. Richard Wagner was a socialist. We'll get to that. Right, he's an 1848er. He's a socialist, not a Marxist. He's a Proudhonian anarchist socialist. And he's also a crazy German nationalist and anti-Semite, too, which is also part of the history of socialism as well. Okay, not so that we don't get too much off topic. Let's see what Baudelaire has to tell us about modernism, because it's going to introduce the sublime with the beautiful. And the question of, again, modernity in the realm of literature and art. This new consciousness of historical task. So these are his late, what he calls prose poems, but they're not. They're aphorisms, really. And he writes a dedication to his publisher. We're going to look at a few of these. This is from the Paris Spleen. As my dear friend, I send you a little work of which no one can say without doing it injustice. It has neither head nor tail, since, on the contrary, everything in it is both head and tail, alternately and reciprocally. I beg you to consider how admirably convenient this combination is for all of us, for you, for me, and for the reader. We can cut wherever we please. I, my dreaming, you, your manuscript, the reader is reading. For I do not keep the reader's restive mind hanging in suspense on the threads of an interminable and superfluous plot. Take away one vertebra and the two ends of this torturous fantasy come together again without pain. Chop it into numerous pieces and you'll see that each one can get along alone. In the hope that there is enough life in some of these segments to please and to amuse you, I take the liberty of dedicating the whole serpent to you. I have a little confession to make. It was while running through, for the 20th time at least, the pages of the famous Gaspard de Louis by Aloysius Bertrand, has not a book known to you, to me, and a few of our friends, the right to be called famous. But the idea came to me of attempting something in the same vein and of applying to the description of our more abstract modern life the same method he used in depicting the old days so strangely picturesque. Which one of us in his moments of ambition has not dreamed of the miracle of a poetic prose, musical, without rhythm and without rhyme, supple enough and rugged enough to adapt itself to the lyrical impulses of the soul, the undulation of reverie, and the jibes of conscience. It was above all out of my exploration of huge cities, out of the medley of their innumerable interrelations, that this haunting ideal was born. You yourself, dear friend, have you not tried to translate in a song the glazier's strident cry and to express in lyric prose all the dismal suggestions that this cry sends up through the fog of the street to the highest garrets? To tell the truth, however, I'm afraid that my envy has not been propitious. From the very beginning I perceived that I was not only far from my mysterious and brilliant model, but was indeed doing something, if it can be called something, singularly different, an accident which anyone else would glory in, no doubt, but which can only deeply humiliate a mind convinced that the greatest honor for a poet is to succeed in doing exactly what he set out to do. Okay, so modernism, inspired by huge cities and their innumerable interrelations, the medley of their innumerable interrelations, and that this has something to do with a form that can adapt itself to the lyrical impulses of the soul, the undulations of reverie, and the jibes of conscience. Right, so a new sensibility, a new subjectivity, and how to be true to that maybe the old forms can't express, can't do justice to in some way. Right? The condition of the modernist writer or the modernist artist is that they can't be sure that they've produced anything at all, let alone what it is. If it's something at all, what is it? And he says we could view that positively or we could view it negatively. So he's deeply ambivalent about this. He says, this could be a happy accident, or maybe it's deeply humiliating for the artist in terms of being unable to realize their intention. Right, that is the condition of the writer or the artist in modernity, the modernist condition of the artist or the writer. When they make something, they're not sure if they've made anything at all. If they did, they're not sure what it is, and they don't know whether it fulfills their intention or is a kind of accident. It's very different from the way art was thought about up to that point. So it has echoes of Romanticism. It's very different from a classical notion of art. Very different. Okay. We'll look at 3 of his pieces from this. The Stranger. This is in the form of a kind of dialogue, a kind of call and response dialogue. Tell me, enigmatical man, whom do you love best? Your father, your mother, your sister, or your brother? I have neither father nor mother, nor sister nor brother. Your friends? Now you use a word whose meaning I have never known. Your country? I do not know in what latitude it lies. Beauty? I could indeed love her, goddess and immortal. Gold? I hate it, as you hate God. Then what do you love, extraordinary stranger? I love the clouds that pass. Up there are the wonderful clouds. So, very deliberate, active reversion from the beautiful to the charming that we talked about last week. Right, so he's, of course, he knows his Kantian aesthetics and all the repercussions through Schiller and others, and he's taking issue with it directly. Right, he's saying kind of an objectless beauty that maybe is just the free play of the imagination is just charming, but that's the beautiful, that's the love object. So the love object is actually not an object at all, but some kind of projection of the subject, of a kind of narcissistic subject, as we'll see. The artist's confiteor, the artist's confessor. How poignant the late afternoons of autumn. Poignant to the verge of pain. For there are certain delicious sensations which are no less intense for being vague, and there is no sharper point than that of infinity. What bliss to plunge the eyes into the immensity of sky and sea, solitude, silence, incomparable chastity of the blue, a tiny sail shivering on the horizon, imitating by its littleness and loneliness my irremediable existence, monotonous melody of the waves. All these things think through me, or I through them. For in the grandeur of reverie the ego is quickly lost. I say they think, but musically and picturesquely, without quibblings, without syllogisms, without deductions. These thoughts, whether they come from me or spring from things, soon, at all events, grow too intense. Energy and voluptuousness creates uneasiness and actual pain. My nerves are strung to such a pitch that they can no longer give out anything but shrill and painful vibrations. And now the profound depth of the sky dismays me. Its purity irritates me. The insensibility of the sea, the immutability of the whole spectacle revolt me. Must one eternally suffer, or else eternally flee beauty? nature, pitiless sorceress, ever victorious rival, do let me be. Stop tempting my desires and my pride. The study of beauty is a duel in which the artist shrieks with terror before being overcome. Okay, so the opposite of the Kantian sublime. The Kantian sublime is about the threshold experience of feeling like you could be overwhelmed, but you're not overwhelmed. So it's frightful, but not terrorizing, not terrifying, right? So it doesn't cross the threshold from fear to terror. But he's saying no. Also, the sympathetic resonance of subject and object when the object is experienced as beautiful. No is now an antagonistic duel in which one side has to overcome the other side. Right, so again, kind of invocation of the sublime with respect to the beautiful, but also an inversion of the value of the beautiful in Kantian terms. I will use to illustrate that one a friend of Baudelaire, and that's Gustave Courbet. Actually, I don't know if that's the Stormy. Oh yeah, it's the Condesi actually. It's not the Stormy, it's the Condesi. So this is a Courbet painting. He's a friend, acquaintance of Baudelaire, inspired by Baudelaire, but also inspirational for Baudelaire. So you've got two boats, maybe three, out on the water, and you got two boats on the shoreline. So you have these sort of figures in the painting that can be kind of proxies or stand-ins for the viewer. Right, so the viewer is both regarding the whole scene, but also potentially seeing things from the standpoints within the imagined space of the painting. Now, why do I say that? Because you have the horizon line very low, and you have a kind of realistic kind of perspective. But then the sky seems to be seen from a slightly different angle, meaning it seems to be seen also from below, and not only laterally. So you're kind of seeing two different perspectives at the same time. So you might be seeing things from the perspective of a closer shoreline, or maybe from the perspective of the boat on the water. And it's the calm sea, and yet it also has this kind of menacing character to it. Now we will, I think it came up in the notes, we'll look at the Casper David Friedrich, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. This is a conventional illustration of the sublime in art, where it's less giving you a sublime experience than it is giving you the idea of a sublime experience, right? So visually, there's not much to the painting, but you do get a sense of what the character in the painting is likely to be feeling. Up on the craggy rocks at the edge of this huge abyss, right? Which no one would stand confidently like that in that position, really. No, not really. No. Right, and so again, it's sort of meeting the otherwise potentially terrifying spectacle with the kind of a courage that makes it fearful but not overwhelmingly terrifying. Again, the sublime. And part of what's going on with Romanticism is that there is a kind of tipping over from a kind of aesthetic presentation to more of a kind of conceptual content to the artwork. So the artwork is kind of giving you the idea of something that is unrepresentable, that's undepictable. Right? So it's understood that you can't actually depict this through painting, and so you're going to be depicting what can't be depicted. Of course, that also exists before this time, but there's a kind of a tipping over more into the realm of we're going to paint in such a way as to demonstrate what painting can't deliver but can only suggest. Because there is, as Kant discusses, also this funny relationship with the sublime between the aesthetic and the conceptual, the aesthetic and the understanding as a faculty that he wants to distinguish. All right. Finally, look at the last two pieces in this Paris spleen. Paris spleen means Paris melancholy. Spleen means melancholy. It's an antique word for melancholy. Or we could say in the DSM language, depression. Paris depression would also be another translation of the title. So here's the epilogue, which is back to verse poem, traditional verse poem. Happy of heart, I climb the hill to contemplate the town in its enormity. Brothel and hospital, prison, purgatory, hell. Monstrosities flowering like a flower. But you, O Satan, patron of my pain, know I went not to weep for them in vain. But like old lecher to old mistress goes, seeking but rapture, I sought out this trull, immense, whose hellish charm resuscitates. Whether in morning sheets you lie asleep, hidden and heavy with the cold, or flaunt through the night in golden spangled veils, infamous city, I adore you. Courtesans and bandits, you offer me such joys the common herd can never understand. So again, the modern city, the kind of anonymous city, where people don't know each other, the joys offered by the common herd that the common herd itself can't understand, though, right? So that's kind of a paradox. Also, there's a little Foucault in there, right? So what is the city? It's a hospital, prison, brothel. You could also have said factory, school, right? All the disciplinary institutions, including the discipline of sexuality itself in the brothel. And then the idea that this is also some kind of struggle with boredom. The beginning of the Fleur du Mal, the Flowers of Evil, the dedication to the reader there is a poem about how boredom is the big thing threatening humanity. And he's basically saying at the beginning of his collection of poems, maybe all he's doing is trying to stave off boredom. Like maybe that's why the reader is reading this book, out of boredom. Okay, and then there is a selection from the Fleur du Mal, Beauty. And again, very much directed in dialogue with, contestation with Kant. I am as lovely as a dream in stone. My breast, on which each finds its death, his death in turn, inspires the poet with a love as lone as everlasting clay, and is taciturn. Swan white of heart, a sphinx no mortal knows, my throne is in the heaven's azure deep. I hate all movement that disturbs my pose. I smile not ever, neither do I weep. Before my monumental attitudes, taken from the proudest plastic arts, my poets pray in austere, studious moods. For I, to fold enchantment round their hearts, have pools of light where beauty flames and dies, the placid mirrors of my luminous eyes. So, Kant's description and discussion of the beautiful in the selections we had last week is that you have this inanimate object that seems to be more than that when we regard it as beautiful. So whether an object of nature or an object of human creation and art, it seems to be alive in a way that it is not. Right? So you take the inert object, you bring it to life. It's through the activity of the imagination. First week of class, we had the archaic torso of Apollo by Rilke. Why is it not just a defaced stone? Why does it seem to come to life in the imagination? Here it's the opposite. Here beauty is a function of taking life and freezing it. petrifying it. It's like a Medusa's gaze. And the sympathetic resonance, the reflection of the subject in the object, is this terrifying mirror where the subject flames and dies. And art is about this sort of taciturn, kind of indeterminate, fungible stuff, clay, right, rather than a kind of apparent intersubjective experience between the subject and the object. Instead, there's a kind of lack of communication between subject and object. It's taciturn. Right, so artists seem to be about, again, bringing life and bringing movement to a halt in their creations. And the beauty itself seems to be, again, like this kind of Medusa's gaze, kind of goddess. So the exact opposite of what Kant thought. And what we're going to start bridging into this week, but get to next week, the idea of living form. The idea of living form. So even the way we tend to think about form, we tend to think about form as a constraint, as a limitation, as a kind of arresting of motion. Right, so form and content seems alive, form seems kind of dead. But no, that's not the way Kant thinks about form at all. Aesthetic form is characterized precisely by the fact that it's form that seems to have a life to it. It has the character of living form. So the first determination of that was the beautiful object. The beautiful object appears to be more than what it is because its form seems to be alive. Whereas in literal terms, the object is this inert thing. So a cut flower off a plant is no longer a living organism. It's a anatomically analyzed, distinguished body part. It's been killed so that it can be displayed as an object of beauty. And yet, it seems to have a living form in the way that the plant actually doesn't. Even though the plant is alive, the flower as a beautiful object appears to have this other life, a life through its aesthetic form. Right, so this is the challenge. The challenge is to, how do we account for the experience of the beautiful in which you have the appearance of living form. Living form. We're going to see with the Sublime, Sublime refers not to objects. He's very specific about this. So objects are not sublime. What's sublime is forces. Forces are sublime. So something has to have the character of a force. It has to have a kind of energy to it to be sublime. That's very important. Objects themselves are not sublime. Objects can be beautiful and seem to exceed themselves, but then the question is, what about our experience of things? What about phenomena of experience that are not objects? So he brings in the Sublime to address that. All right, so where do you guys want to start with the notes? We'll start and then we'll have a short break, but I want to at least start us out. Yeah. How did you guys divide this stuff up? Did you not?
No.
Okay. Did either of you deal with the kind of summing up of last week's reading, the dialectic of how much they subdivide this. I guess they do so. Okay, so we were at the right place. Or shall we? Maybe let's take our break now. Let's take 5 minutes. Take 5 minutes. All right, let's resume. I think we're all back. Yes. Okay, so, which of you would like to start?
I can start.
Okay.
Yeah, so the reading assignments that we have this week are kind of like pulled from pages 103, 117, 130, and 151 for the definitions of sublime. So Kant insists that no object of nature is the sublime. The sublime arrays in the mind when imagination is overwhelmed by something large, and then reason asserts itself, allowing the mind to comprehend concepts like infinity or moral law that imagination alone cannot contain. So unlike beauty, which can exist in like an object such as form, harmony, proportions, the sublime come from formlessness, vagueness, and power that exceeds sense experience. And so judgment of the sublime like those of the beautiful must be universal, which is say on page 105, and this kind of like raised the questions if the sublime originally made subjectively in the mind, does it claim to universally come from the fact that all humans share the same faculties of imaginations and reasons? So and then the contract between we can address that question first.
Yeah, so let's, I guess this is still a sticking point, but we need to sort of flesh it out now. So, I think when we were talking about Kant's critiques in the virtues, the true, the good, and the beautiful, as principles, are universal. Why? Because all human communities, cultures, ever, or wherever and whenever, have had notions of the true, the good, and the beautiful, even though the specific content of them has changed historically and varies culturally. Still, these are universal things. Similarly, the beautiful, just understood sort of broadly, but getting more specific, the experience of the sublime is universal, meaning people have had it throughout all cultures, across all history. This seems to be a universal experience that humans have. Right? So the question, of course, because we are living in barbarism, we might think that the universality of these things are biological in character. We might do like neurological experiments about the experience of the beautiful and the sublime, but that would lose the point. The point is that what we experience as beautiful and what we experience as sublime changes. So though we might have that experience, what it is that causes us to have that experience does change. Right? And so you won't be able to find it in our neurology other than in the banal sense of, okay, well, we all seem to be able to have this experience, but the occasion for the experience differs. Right, so it's like the antinomy of taste, which we're going to start getting into, which is that to each his own, meaning everyone has their own taste, and yet everyone has taste. Right, so everyone exercises judgments of taste, even though they might exercise judgments of taste differently. Everyone has different taste, nonetheless everyone does have taste. Right, so the particular and the universal don't actually contradict each other, but indeed only make sense relative to each other. So, what he's doing analytically here, the distinction between the beautiful and the sublime should not be hypostasized, right? So it's not like an either or. It's not like a black and white distinction. It's not. Right? So one has an aesthetic experience of everything all the time, constantly. We're constantly processing things aesthetically. And the experience of the beautiful refers to one aspect of that experience. The experience of the sublime refers to another aspect of that experience. Works of art can have both principles at work because our experience has the character of both. All right, so these are analytic distinctions. But again, universality of the sublime, he's just sort of establishing, okay, there is something, the sublime. Whenever we say that's, the beautiful, the sublime, when we give it a definite article like that, we're turning it from an empirical thing into a metaphysical thing. So not a beautiful thing or a sublime event, but the sublime, the beautiful, turns it into a metaphysical object or a metaphysical category. And so again, the categories, metaphysical categories, do not refer to things in the world or the world in itself, but refer for Kant to our faculties. So the sublime exists by virtue of our faculties existing. And those faculties are universal. Right, so there is a real metaphysical substance to this metaphysical phenomenon, the sublime.
Which kind of brings to my third point an example. So the contrast between the beauty and the sublime is key. Beauty engage in form and harmony, like I say, while the sublime has more philosophical way because it forces the mind to move from imagination to reason with the capital R. And one of the paintings that I picked for the example was from Caspar Friedrich. Yeah, that one is called The Wonder Above the Sea of Fog, kind of captures the lone figure. In German, I think it's called Ruperfigure or something. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's called...
Does it give the German? Hold on.
Yeah, Rücken figure.
In the second paragraph.
Yeah.
Oh, it has yet another one? Oh, this.
Yeah. Basically like
Oh, this is the form, yes.
Yeah.
Like facing the figure from the back, yes.
Yeah, and we see the behind of the figure, which kind of like contemplate this big misty landscape, which overwhelms the imagination and elevates the mind, I guess. And the sublime does not reside in the mountain of the fog, but in the mental experience of the viewer. So question is like, if the sublime is universal and mental, how does this fit into cultural reading? Because this painting itself is a romantic idea of the sublime, and for instance, Friedrich's work is often seen as reflecting German romantic ideas, right? And if Kant says sublime is universal, the same for everyone, does that conflict with the idea that people in different culture history experience it differently?
Well, it might be thematized differently concretely, right? So like this whole idea of like a kind of a bourgeois dude, it's kind of city dress. I mean, he's got kind of boots, so maybe kind of city guy going out to the country, and he's got his walking stick, right? And then this particular kind of scene, is obviously culturally, historically specific. Nonetheless, the experience that is suggested, and part of it has to do with the fact that we don't see it in his facial expression or something like that. We see it maybe in his stance, this kind of commanding, kind of like confident pose. But we don't really get much of an indication besides that. So there's nothing to see in terms of the figure. The figure doesn't offer us much to see. But also the landscape doesn't offer us much to see either. Like visually, there's not much here. It's pretty austere. And so it does move us from the sensuous experience to a more kind of conceptual realm. And it suggests a kind of practical relation to the world, right? So that's the movement from the movement to reason, right? Which is significant when we talked about the three critiques. I pointed out that with the introduction, he says there are two sets of categories, or two kinds of concepts, concepts of nature, concepts of what is, and concepts of freedom. And that the understanding and really concepts in general, theories in general, are about the way the world is. Whereas practical reason or reason, so the understanding as a faculty is about the way the world is. Reason is about our freedom, namely our ability to change things, including change ourselves. So to change our practical relation to change ourselves in that practical relation.
Yeah, so there's a section where he talks about like beauty's relation to culture, and I think he makes it pretty unequivocal. He says that like beauty itself is transcendental, so like it kind of comes from cognitive powers, but like once something is like, I guess like produced as beautiful or recognized as beautiful, then like culture can kind of seize upon it. But this is an interest now.
Right.
So it's not transcendental, it's empirical.
Right.
So like cultural beauty isn't the same as transcendental beauty.
That's right.
It's like this secondary form of beauty that's empirical.
Yeah, so it would correspond more to an idea of the beautiful or a concept of the beautiful rather than the experience of the beautiful itself. There's also another curious thing here about the Sublime. So he does, so if you remember from Robert Pippin the first week, that Hegel's the historicizing thinker, but it's in Kant too. Meaning you'll notice that the experience of the Sublime he associates with a kind of cultural history, and that is monotheism. So he thinks that when our experience of divinity, experience of the gods or God, goes from being terrifying to becoming merely fearful rather than terrifying, that is a kind of historical development of our experience of the world as sublime. Right? So the gods were terrifying because they just tortured us. Right? So you guys know this. Or maybe you don't know this. So the gods might have created us, but then they kind of are jealous of us, and then they do these crazy things to us. They curse us. They kind of condemn us to tragic fates. And this is something that we'll get to later in the course. In tragedy, the heroic protagonist suffers a tragic fate as punishment by the gods for their virtue. So a virtuous person is punished for their virtue by jealous gods. So it's like a hateful relationship between people and the gods. Monotheism, by contrast, namely Judaism, Christianity, Islam, he says, are about this other relationship to God or to divinity, which is not terrifying, but fearful, but not terrifying. It's more of a sympathetic relationship between the creature and the creator. Right? Whereas he knows before that, right, the gods were terrifying. And you can even see that history in the Old Testament itself, meaning Yahweh goes from being terrifying to being fearful. Yahweh goes from being kind of awful and punishing to being forgiving and understanding. And then, of course, that develops in Christianity. And then, of course, Islam has its own culmination of that tradition. So, he does associate it with historical development of religion, at least in the Abrahamic traditions. But you could extend it. In other words, you could say that in all the classical civilizations, like Hinduism, and then certainly Buddhism as a kind of an outgrowth of Hinduism, that there's a shift from the gods being terrifying to the gods being more benevolent and kind of compassionate and forgiving. Right. So there is some history there. There's some suggested at least thousands of years, right? So this would be over a very extended period of time if this would be the case. When we're dealing with the universal, we are dealing with the kind of experience that we're having rather than the objects of the experience. And certainly not with the concepts of the experience. Sonny.
All right. I got like a couple little things and then one kind of weird, not side tangent, but not directly related. The text so much it is like alternate proposal. Maybe. I don't know. But okay. Starting with the smaller stuff. The way I was reading the first part and the second part, this first part especially, was like whenever he brings up like an aesthetic category and then like talks about how it works, I'm trying to fit like aesthetic experiences I've had into it. Like, ooh, does this fit under this? Does this fit under this? And the two that I kept kind of coming back to as being like I'm interested in how they either fit or don't fit is the humorous for one, but then also like I don't know how to say it other than like the ironical. There's like, I mean especially in art, but in nature as well. There's some things where you have an aesthetic experience not because of the form or because of a force, but because of like a contradiction between it and its surroundings. Like I don't know, like it's like the classic sort of like artsy image of like a little like flower like growing in between like things of cement, right? Where it's not the form or it's like purpose and it's not the sublime like thing, but it's a contrast between two things that creates this sort of dissonance that is the aesthetic experience. And I think that's related to humor, in that most humor is ironic in some sense. I was reminded of like Spinoza's idea of humor, which kind of relates to like conditioned beauty in the first part, where Spinoza talks about humor being like developed when you see like stuff not acting according to its function. Like if a person falls over, it's funny because you expect a person to walk and like navigate things accurately. So when they fall, then it's kind of like in the same way that pure beauty is an absence of purpose, that's like a negation of its purpose. But I'm wondering how you would see these fitting into the Kant's idea of the sublime, the beautiful, whether they are or aren't, and whether that matters, I guess.
Well, irony, we might leave irony until Hegel. We might. I don't know. 'Cause it seems like you're discussing irony in a different sense than he's going to be discussing it. He'll be discussing it in terms of romanticism. And irony as regards form itself, right? So that's a little bit different from an experience of a natural object or a natural event. So contradiction.
Doesn't this seem to involve concepts? Like humor seems to need concepts, so that would be non-aesthetic.
But you still
Maybe not.
It manifests
maybe not.
phenomenologically, even though it's I guess conceptually based, which is
It's a realm of feeling. It's definitely a realm of feeling. Yeah, I would say that it might involve concepts, but it might also be something might be humorous in the sense of all sorts of things. Because humorous is a kind of a broad category. It doesn't mean funny, like haha funny, or funny in a broad sense too, like uncanny. We can certainly have an experience of humor that we can't explain conceptually why we find something humorous. So it would definitely fit within a kind of aesthetic in Kant's terms, meaning it's not reducible to a conceptual.
Yeah, well, it's indeterminate, right? There's this free interplay that jokes rely upon between intuition and understanding. So yeah, I think that's right.
And that's a little bit different from ironical, because ironical, and this is where we're getting into it with Hegel a little bit, ironical tends to suggest, in the way that we tend to use it, the defeat of meaning. The defeat of meaning, right? And so that certainly is not Kant's concern here. Like Kant's concern is meaningful experience, meaning the experience of the beautiful is a meaningful experience. The experience of the sublime is a meaningful experience. It's not the experience of a lack of meaning in the experience.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, he was definitely thinking about a different art than I guess I'm thinking about, but
You're thinking more like lack of meaning in art, maybe. It's a little
yeah, but I don't think
postmodernist.
it's so much lack of meaning,
Uh-huh.
but more just like evocation based on a sort of interesting, seemingly dissonant pairing of things. Like,
Uh-huh.
like this realist comes to mind where it's just like, oh, like, yeah, like it's an elephant, but its legs are really skinny, and the aesthetic experience comes out of it's not necessarily a contradiction, but the evocative character
Yeah.
is in like its abnormality.
Uh-huh. Actually, I meant to bring up the surrealists. So surrealism would be 20th century avant-garde, like Dada surrealism, and surrealism very explicitly harks back to Baudelaire, meaning they're trying to keep the Baudelairean project alive, and they realize that it has to be done differently than it was with Courbet and Manet and the Impressionists and others, and even in literature like Mallarmé and Rimbaud and Valoret. Like the surrealists are trying to sort of like reattain that Baudelairean kind of truth, we might say, for their time, and discovering that it has to be different. Now, surrealism, we brought up realism. Surrealism doesn't mean other than real. It means intensified reality, right? So, in that sense, you could make two kinds of anthropological arguments. You could make the anthropological argument that all art is realistic as regards to the reality that people live in, meaning the reality of the imagined world that we inhabit. So all art represents not sense data perception, but represents or objectifies subjectivity. Now, of course, for the surrealists, all art is surrealist. In other words, going back to the cave paintings, all art is surrealist, because the cave painting of the deer is like a surreal depiction of the deer. In other words, it's an intensified presence, reality of the deer, as opposed to just the ordinary sense perception of the deer. Right? So all art would be surrealist because it would sort of give you the quintessence, the distilled essence of reality, rather than just the ordinary kind of empirical reality. And by the way, that's the difference between realism and naturalism. So naturalism is like copying from nature, and realism is about capturing the essence of nature. That isn't just sort of copying from nature. Although those terms can be used in the opposite way. Sometimes the realism is merely the copying of nature, and naturalism is capturing its essence. So, but that's just semantics.
Yeah, I was going to say, back to, I guess, these, I guess, extra aesthetic experiences that don't neatly fit in. When I guess we're about to, in the next part.
So surrealism is not, surrealism is about preserving the meaning
well, then
of
not
our experience.
Surrealism,
Right.
but like the ironical or like the humorous as these things that you can make aesthetic judgments about that aren't part of these two. I guess, does that...
He's going to bring up, I thought that he did in this week's reading, he goes through the forms, like he goes through different forms. And I thought he did bring up humor.
Might have missed it.
I'm thinking now about like this idea of like an aesthetic humor. And I wonder if we can think about the idea of like a negative beauty. Meaning like it's still beauty, it still produces pleasure, but it's negative in the sense that like the harmony that we're looking for, the indeterminate harmony that we're looking for between imagination and concepts, is actually like a negative relationship. Like that's the unexpected moment, right? Like the surrealist, what is it, like a lobster and a telephone on a surgery table or whatever. So it's like, a priori these things apparently do something together because we laugh, right?
Yeah.
But it's not like an articulable relation.
Yeah.
They seem to repel each other logically, right? Or like,
But they're just encapsulated under one sort of like machine or essence.
well, and the only reason we know that is because it produces pleasure, right?
Yeah.
So that's how it qualifies as
We
beauty,
conceptualize the
right?
two as one thing,
Yeah.
like one effect.
Right, but when you separate them logically and just like look at them after you've laughed or whatever, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
There's not like a coherent concept to like draw it back to this. So that's why maybe like negative beauty, or I don't know.
Well, those kinds of like negative relations would be distinctions, right? So that's why I would say that, I mean, I'm kind of still thinking about this contradiction idea. That it really is about like a dissonance or a disjunction. And like I said, I think that he does describe humor as that, in fact.
I think it's on page 228.
Oh, it's
All the way
really
to
at
the
the
end.
end. Okay. It's all the way at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
And our brains are fried.
I think it's literally the last page.
Oh yeah, you're right. It is the very, very end. I thought so, right? So let's look at this. Oh, this is about taste. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, here we go. Okay, so naivete. Let's see where he starts this. Oh, okay, so laughter. Okay, here we go. If we admit that with all of our thoughts is harmonically combined a movement in the organs of the body, right, so all of our thoughts correspond to movements in the body, we shall easily comprehend how to this sudden transposition of the mind, now to one, now to the other standpoint, in order to contemplate its object, may correspond an alternating tension and relaxation of the elastic portions of our intestines, which communicates itself to the diaphragm, like that which ticklish people feel. In connection with this, the lungs expel the air at rapidly succeeding intervals, and thus bring about a movement beneficial to health, which alone, and not what precedes it in the mind, is the proper cause of the gratification in a thought that at bottom represents nothing. Voltaire said that heaven had given us two things to counterbalance the many miseries of life, hope and sleep. He could have added laughter, if the means of exciting it in reasonable men were only as easily attainable, and the requisite wit or originality of humor were not so rare. As the talent is common of imagining things which break one's head, as mystic dreamers do, or which break one's neck, as your genius does, or which break one's heart, as sentimental romance writers and even moralists of the same kidney do. We may therefore, as it seems to me, readily concede to Epicurus, so that's a pre-Socratic ancient philosopher, that all gratification, even that which is occasioned through concepts excited by aesthetical ideas, is animal, i.e. bodily sensation, without the least prejudice to the spiritual feeling of respect for moral ideas, which is not gratification at all, but an esteem for self, for humanity in us, that raises us above the need of gratification, and even without the slightest prejudice, to the less noble feeling of taste. So part of what he's trying to get at here is to laugh is human, right? So when we laugh, we are also respecting our humanity. So it isn't just an animal response. We find a combination of these two last in naivete, which is the breaking out of the sincerity originally natural to humanity in opposition to that art of dissimulation, which has become a second nature. We laugh at the simplicity that does not understand how to dissemble, and yet we are delighted with the simplicity of the nature which thwarts that of art. We look for the commonplace manner of artificial utterance devised with foresight to make a fair show, and behold, it is the unspoiled innocent nature which we do not expect to find, and which he who displays it did not think of disclosing. That the fair but false show, which generally has so much influence upon our judgment, is here suddenly transformed into nothing. So that, as it were, the rogue in us is laid bare, produces a movement of the mind in two opposite directions, which gives a wholesome shock to the body. But the fact that something infinitely better than all assumed manner, the purity of disposition, or at least the tendency thereto, is not quite extinguished yet in human nature, blends seriousness and high esteem with this play of the judgment. But because it is only a transitory phenomenon, and the veil of dissimulation is soon drawn over it again, there is mingled therewith a compassion, which is an emotion of tenderness. This, as play, readily admits of combination with a good-hearted laugh, and ordinarily is actually so combined, and withal is wont to compensate him who supplies its material for the embarrassment which results from not yet being wise after the manners of men. An art that is said to be naive, or an art that is to be naive, is thus a contradiction, but the representation of naivete in a fictitious personage is quite possible, and it is a beautiful though a rare art. Naivete must not be confounded with open-hearted simplicity, which does not artificially spoil nature solely because it does not understand the art of social intercourse. The humorous manner, again, may be classified as that which, as exhilarating us, is near akin to the gratification that proceeds from laughter, and belongs to the originality of spirit, but not to the talent of beautiful art. Humor is the good sense in the good sense, means the talent of being able voluntarily to put oneself in a certain mental disposition in which everything is judged quite differently from the ordinary method, reversed in fact, and yet in accordance with certain rational principles in such a frame of mind. He who is involuntarily subject to such mutations is called a man of humors, and he who can assume them voluntarily and purposively on behalf of a lively presentiment brought about by the aid of a contrast that excites a laugh, he and his manner of speech are called humors. This manner, however, belongs rather to the pleasant than to beautiful art, because the object of the latter must always exhibit intrinsic worth, and hence requires a certain seriousness in the presentation, as taste does in the act of judgment. Okay.
Now, I think, I don't know, I challenged it last part, like, I think that, like humor doesn't have to be frivolous, right? Like, humor can be sublime. Like, there can be humor that destitutes power or something like that, you know, humor that goes into big places. So,
Is humor defined by like the delivery of it from a person, or it doesn't exist in the understanding?
Well, I think that actually that's part of what he's saying and why this is coming at the end of the Analytic of the Sublime. Meaning it is more, it's a matter of taste, right? But it is also, it's about the kind of the subject. So it's about our ability to experience the humorous. So it's not something that we attribute just to the performer, right? And it's evanescent, so it's kind of like it's there and it's gone. And then when you try to explain it, it doesn't, you can't reproduce the feeling. So it's kind of an event. And it has to do with like practical life and moral behavior, right? So it's about like the reversal of our ordinary practical moral values that we find pleasant as opposed to painful, right? So the question is, why would we find it pleasant, and how do we find it pleasant? Right, so what is that feeling? How does it happen? Why does it happen? What are the conditions of possibility for humor? That's what he's really doing.
Doesn't it have to do with reason? Like the understanding of something that may be negative, but in a beautiful way gives us access to that reasoning, and processing it becomes something that is pleasant.
Yes. Okay, so here's a distinction that we made last week that pertains. So we can admire the elegance of someone's wit without actually finding them funny. Right? We could say, oh, that's clever, but it doesn't actually make you laugh. Right? So the way he describes it here, it's almost as if like in a comic performance, like that the person who's performing it and who makes people laugh is almost themselves not able to account for what makes it funny or not. It's like it has this kind of spontaneous character, right? So it can't be like a perfectly executed, like a kind of well-engineered performance that won't actually produce the result, won't actually produce that phenomenon. So again, like something that makes you laugh, it's an involuntary thing, right? And so, in that respect, it is like the sublime because but it's also like the beautiful, because the sublime is unexpected and it sort of, threatens to overwhelm us, but then it doesn't, and it is this kind of moment in a kind of dynamic relationship to the phenomenon. The beautiful is also like that, however. So these, again, are not like hard and fast distinctions. He's saying, why would we take pleasure in contradiction? How does that happen? Right? What is that feeling about? What are we responding to? How is it working? Right? What makes it possible? And you could say, humor is in the eye of the beholder. You could say that. You could also say that, like, what's the difference between like a humorous joke and an insulting, offensive joke? Right? That in some ways, like in the moment, it's humorous, and then like if you lift it out of context, if you like clip it, and then it becomes like offensive,
But that's the same
Right?
for the beautiful, that a beautiful thing, if you put it in different contexts, can become ugly, right? And the humor still has the same sort of claim to
It's not that it
universality,
would
right?
become ugly, it would become not beautiful. Meaning taken out of context, it becomes not funny, not humorous. And then it just becomes a violation of practical morality and whatever he puts it, the art of social intercourse. It's like, it goes from being humorous to becoming rude behavior. Right.
But he's saying here that this isn't, we're not dealing with beautiful here, we're
Right.
just dealing with like, what term is it, agreeable, I'm not looking for the term.
Pleasant.
But,
Yeah.
wait.
Rather pleasant than beautiful art.
The pleasant. The
Wait,
pleasant.
okay, this
Yeah,
line,
pleasant.
I realize why I'm confused, this line, this sentence, this manner, however, belongs rather to pleasant than to beautiful art, but the beautiful is what causes pleasure. I'm a little confused with that sentence. Those seem to be linked, like the pleasant is the beautiful. I think, did he mean to say rather to be agreeable than to beautiful art? This manner, however, belongs rather to agreeable than to beautiful, is that what he meant? Because I can't make any sense of that.
Okay. This manner, however, belongs rather to the pleasant than to beautiful art. The manner of speech, called humorous, right? Because the object of the latter, beautiful art, must always exhibit intrinsic worth. So that has more to do with like again, what we talked about last week. An object is considered beautiful when it seems to be kind of self-determined, when it seems to have a kind of aesthetic integrity, where it seems to exist for its own sake. So purposiveness without purpose, which something pleasant doesn't have to have that character, right? Something can please us without having the character of having purposiveness without purpose.
Well, then it needs purposiveness for the power of judgment. Right? Beautiful needs purposiveness for the power of judgment with respect to translative understanding and imagination.
Yeah, it tells us about our own purposiveness without purpose, namely our freedom. And the judgment is the highest faculty of recognizing our freedom. That's true.
Isn't humor directly related to the pursuit of freedom? And in that freedom, there is a purposiveness, so that is why it would be pleasant and not
Yeah.
beautiful.
Right, so the man of humors versus the humorous person, right? So what's the distinction there? That would seem to be no distinction at all. So someone who seems to be kind of inadvertently, involuntarily funny is different from someone who's able to kind of achieve a kind of funny effect.
But what we think is personally, like what makes us laugh versus what we intellectually deem funny has to do with our own sense of freedom. Like
Yes.
What the feelings or thoughts or ideas that we repress
Right.
and don't feel allowed to experience, and then in that moment get to experience.
We
it
recognize
as,
it.
as, as genuine laughter,
Mm-hmm.
and then that freedom is exercised. But that doesn't mean that that same joke would make you laugh another day.
It might or it might not.
Based
Again,
on how you feel internally.
maybe. Okay, so this is an important point. So it can't be entirely mood dependent. It can't entirely be mood dependent. Meaning,
I'm not even talking about mood, I'm talking about like who a person is at one moment in time.
right. So let me unpack this. So the beautiful, the sublime, the humorous, also genius, which we have to get to, appear spontaneous. In other words, they don't appear determined or determinate. They appear indeterminate. In other words, they appear to not be determined by anything, namely heteronymous. So they're not caused by something else. They seem to be their own cause. They seem to be autonomous. So that's part of what we're describing with purposiveness without purpose, is that, and this is one of the reasons when we get to Schiller and Hegel, this is going to be important, why Kant puts nature above art, because nature appears entirely spontaneous, whereas art appears to be determined by humanity, by humans, and therefore not entirely spontaneous. So that's why he thinks the experience of the beautiful in nature is higher than the experience of the beautiful in art, because if art is capable of imitating nature's spontaneity, it still isn't spontaneous the way nature is. So what's curious here is that any spontaneous phenomenon, whether an object or a kind of an event that seems to have a kind of a force or energy to it, or this kind of performative kind of event, like a humorous joke, it appears to be accidental, and yet it appears necessary. Right? That's very important. Right? So part of the aesthetical judgment as a faculty is this connection between necessity and freedom, in other terms that we'll get to later in the course, nature and spirit. It appears to be both spontaneous and therefore inexplicable, like sort of indeterminate, but also appears necessary. It seems like it had to have happened, right? So it's not accidental in the sense of completely arbitrary, but has also the character of necessity. Now, I think that when we talked about it in the first selection of readings from Kant, the dialectic of necessity and freedom is the highest necessity. Right? But that's a paradox. That's a kind of a contradiction, if you will. Meaning, in our freedom, we are determinate beings that are capable of indeterminate things. Meaning, looked at a certain way, everything is determinate. Everything is determinate. Right? Looked at a certain way, you can explain everything as being a function of a causal chain of events. And yet, we do have this experience of things that are indeterminate. Now, there is actually a way of thinking about that. One is, well, science hasn't given us an explanation yet. So everything is determined, but it might elude our understanding. And then one day we will understand why things that appear to be spontaneous accidents are not actually spontaneous accidents. But this is the mere antinomy. In other words, the mere antinomy is necessity versus contingency, or determinateness versus contingency. He's saying, well, no. Why? Because change happens, transformation happens. Meaning if everything is determinate, then nothing would ever change. And yet things do change, including our own sensibilities, including our own experiential capacities, including our subjectivity. So we have to be able to grasp this coincidence of the accidental and the necessary in order to make sense of how things make sense to us, especially aesthetically. So it's not, again, we can make sense of things conceptually through the understanding. We can make sense of things practically through the exercise of reason. But what he's concerned with here in the third critique is what can't be explained any other way. That can only be explained as a function of how we feel about it. Our feeling. And then we find actually, oh, yes, it's in our feeling that we're able to hold these two contradictory things together, namely the accidental and the necessary, or the necessary and, even more importantly, our freedom. Because is our freedom an accident? Now, why did I put all this stuff on the board? Was the revolution an accident? Or was it necessary? Or there's a third option. Freedom. Meaning it could have happened. It was felt to should happen. It did happen. It was neither entirely determined by the past, nor was it entirely a random accident.
But doesn't capitalism skew that natural process?
Of course it does. In other words, we're back to a pre-Kantian antinomy. Meaning in capitalism, we're stuck between a kind of voluntaristic attitude and a deterministic attitude. We're stuck between treating things as accidental and treating them as necessary. Even worse, we're stuck with the notion of freedom that seems to depend entirely on random contingent accident. Right? Epicurus was raised, right? Epicurus was invoked here. So Epicurus is a philosopher of shit happens. Meaning, why does the world exist? Because shit happens. Like, that is Epicurus in a nutshell. right? The world came about through a kind of inexplicable random coincidence of matter falling in space. Okay, so that's thousands of years ago. Have we made any progress since then? Maybe we haven't made any progress since then. But Kant thought that we made progress since then, meaning the difference between our time and Epicurus' time is that we can recognize our freedom in a way that Epicurus could not. Right? So, yes, maybe the universe came about through an entropic process. You know, we're all stardust, and all the heavy elements are the products of supernova, kind of weird random phenomena of a nuclear explosion. But in the meantime, like, we've built things up here, like humans have done things. We're not just natural selection, Darwinian, random mutation. We're not. Right? We're also in control of our own destiny. So there is that reality, but there's this other reality. And that other reality, if we regard it as a random accident or as deterministically caused, we're in this hopeless antinomy where we can't recognize our freedom. Right? We're not subjects, we're objects. Right? We're objects of random chance, or we're objects of logical necessity. But we're objects, we're not subjects. So are we subjects, or are we just objects? That's the question. Right? Concepts of nature, concepts of freedom. So nature is either logically determined, or it's random accidents, or maybe it's some combination of both. Darwinian, random mutation, survival of the fittest, including all human culture and history and society and everything else. That's one way of looking at things. It's why he says science. He also, didn't he have a little thing there? That was in another section where he's like, well, that would be science. That wouldn't be art. It was in before this, like the section right before this. So science is something that's logical. Art is something that is not logical. And yet is still rational. In other words, is our notion of the rational purely logical, or can it admit to things that don't follow a strict logic? Namely, judgments. Judgments are not logical. They can't be reduced to the logical. Humor can't be reduced to the logical, even though we might try to say, oh, logically it's a contradiction. But he deals with that, right? He's saying, yeah, you could kind of think of it that way, but actually it has to be more than that. Right? It has to strike us aesthetically a certain way. It can't just be a logical disjunction. I don't know. How are you guys? Is this making sense?
It's definitely making sense, but I guess that maybe this doesn't matter that much, but just in the next part when he creates like the teleological being as mediated between sublime forces and beautiful objects, I don't see why like humor is like categorically like a less significant sensation such that shouldn't play into...
Does he ever say that?
I guess...
Why do you assume that that's the case?
I guess because he doesn't talk about it as a factor. Or I guess maybe he does, but I wasn't aware of that.
Well, he was saying Voltaire, right? The things that offer consolation for the miseries of life are hope and sleep. He forgot to add humor. He forgot to add laughter. Right? So what's suggested there is that, this is core to our humanity. Right? This is how we're able to lift ourselves above our condition. So we're not only able to lift ourselves above our condition through hope, nor through oblivion, sleep, but also through humor. Right? So it seems like he's not excluding it. Go ahead.
Humor makes room for hope to exist.
Yes, because it allows for, again, a kind of intuitive phenomena that defies explanation and therefore suggests freedom. right? So that's why when he brings up naivete, there's like naivete and naivete. So there's sort of something kind of less than freedom, and then there's something that's more seems to exemplify freedom. So it's not like, oh, someone is unintentionally funny because they don't know the norms of social behavior, versus someone who's able to actively play in the threshold of social norms and able to produce humor out of it. Right? I mean, it would be the difference. He could have easily put it this way: are you laughing at someone or laughing with them? Right? If you're laughing at them, right? If you're laughing with them, then you're seeing a kind of shared humanity precisely at the level of a shared freedom.
Is laughing at someone real laughing?
Maybe not in this sense, right? So maybe in a totally different sense. Maybe in a purely subjective sense, like in the merely subjective sense, meaning that it's a kind of, again, you're laughing at something. But are you laughing with it? In other words, does it seem to exemplify something of you, or is it just this kind of,
But the understanding is necessary for the truth of that humor to exist. Right?
yeah,
And
but
if you're laughing at someone, it's based on not on understanding, but on misunderstanding.
right. So it's not a mutual understanding.
Yeah.
It's a kind of lack of understanding on one side and superior understanding on the other side. Right? I mean, is the only kind of humor that we know. We live in a kind of a little bit of a humorless time, by the way. Right? COVID and I don't know what. Trump has like sucked the air out of the room, and so now we have no space for humor anymore. Right? Or maybe the only space that we have left is sadistic humor. Laughing at things, laughing at people, laughing at ourselves, right? A kind of demeaning, right, rather than an exalting. So does humor exalt the human, or does humor demean the human? Maybe
like a constituent humor that exalts us at the expense of power. What did I see recently? Someone like went to some stupid meeting, neighborhood meeting, whatever these local bureaucrats. Used his time. It was like a
Oh, really?
white guy, like a 50-year-old white guy. You wouldn't expect this. He started breakdancing silently. And
Excellent.
In the last 10 seconds, just made a shit-talking comment about
The whole thing.
inflated taxes or whatever he
Uh-huh.
was supposed to be talking about.
But really making fun of the whole thing, like
Yeah,
the
just
whole
that's
circumstance.
the seriousness and all
Uh-huh.
that, and thereby, and kind of everyone in the crowd laughing in solidarity with him.
Yeah.
The ones up front kind of don't know what to do. It simultaneously.
They might laugh after.
Sure, yeah.
They might laugh after.
But yeah. Well, maybe they're not destituted, but the system of representation has
Sure.
in for these.
Yeah, the political situation is
Yeah.
demeaned.
So it's like
Right.
exaltation and chopping the knees in one blow.
Humor about Trump has been tricky, by the way. Often it's not funny. And then when it is funny, it seems to sort of edge into the direction of too much sympathy for him. But actually, it takes that in order for it to really be funny. Like when it's just sadistic, it's not funny. Right? So that tells us something about the nature of humor, doesn't it? Right? In other words, you can't really do unsympathetic humor. There has to be some sympathy involved. Otherwise, it's not really funny. It's mocking, but that's different. It's not going to be laugh out loud or rolling on the floor laughing. Right?
Political humor, so that
Gut,
the
like a gut humor,
sympathy gives like a moral leverage. Right?
gives a basis, right? So a basis for the condemnation would be the sympathy, right? Rather than this alien life form, is then.
Well, there's a motive behind a lot of that humor. There's like a political motive and wanting to assert
There is
political stance.
a superiority. That's right. A kind of superior understanding. That's right. So there's laughing at Trump. But the real challenge would be laughing with Trump, meaning Trump is funny as hell. It's funny as hell. But it's funny. It's funny as hell. Right? So if we can't allow ourselves that, it's because we're feeling ourselves to be objects, not subjects in the situation, which is understandable. Maybe we're terrified to the point where we don't feel like we're subjects anymore. But, maybe we shouldn't rest with that. Maybe we shouldn't accept that entirely. Charlie Chaplin made fun of Hitler. Effectively. Very effectively. And not just some hack propaganda type, purely conceptual thing. So hopefully that helps, right? But again, that kind of, this is important because, again, we're specifying the subjectivity of it, right? Which then has to be, explained experientially. And it is a little bit, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's the intent of taste, meaning you know it when you experience it. Right? But you don't really know it outside the experience of it. You only know it in the experience of it. And the experience of it can, in this case, again, different from the beautiful object, appears more evanescent, ephemeral. And that's why it's in the chapter on the Sublime, or on the section on the Sublime. Go back to the notes. Let's talk about the Sublime in more detail. I don't know if Zami, do you have anything on that?
I did one that was more about beauty than Sublime. It was from this part, but I talk about it a little bit, but maybe in a weird way. I don't know. It's in the middle.
Uh-huh. Notion of lack. Leave Lacan out of it. No Lacan. Lacan is only a 20th century.
Well, I know that, but experientially, I guess I'll get into it.
Lack or desire?
I can't really see the screen. Can you summarize?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
So,
I can zoom in. Hold on.
Okay, so
What's on?
the quote from page 106, right at the beginning of the section that we read, the feeling of the sublime brings with it the characteristic feature of movement of mind bound up with the judging of the object, while in the case of the beautiful, taste presupposes and maintains the mind in restful contemplation. And the restful contemplation thing, when I was trying to compare it to like my experiences of what I think he means by the beautiful, not like my version of the beautiful that's different, but I'm trying to like match it to the thing that becomes more than just being agreeable and claims universality.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's not, and I guess no way to prove this other than experientially,
Yeah.
but I feel like it's not this static sort of satisfied thing where you're just fine with how it is. I feel like for beautiful things, there's a desire to see it more, to like somehow get closer to it, and there is this sort of like reaching and like this desire. I mean, not to use the Lacanian idea of lack super literally, but I think it definitely gets at something where like beautiful experiences are never really like enough. You always want it to just either last a little bit longer, be like a little bit more powerful. There's like when you look at a painting, you're like reaching out and you like want to touch it, you just want it to pop out like ever so slightly more. But to use like Kant's framing, that like you could see that as even though the object is taking on its own like without like a purpose, maybe like it's not fully ever separating itself. Like you can never fully forget what its original function was, and so the tension there is part of the experience. But I guess that just feels like a very important part of the experience.
Again, it's an analytic distinction. It's only an analytic distinction. It's not a real distinction. It's an analytic distinction. So what's the analytic distinction? It seems that the experience of the beautiful resolves itself in the object. In other words, there is some kind of resolution around the object. And that's what restful contemplation means. It means that it seems to land in an object, therefore something that can be contemplated. Again, we have to think about how we're using these words, because he's trying to describe things. So we have to try to get at what he's trying to describe. The movement, right? A movement of the mind bound up in the judging of the object. So in other words, the act of judgment, and this is why the Sublime is connected more with reason than with understanding. So with understanding, we're dealing with concepts. The word in German for concept is Begriff. Begriff is what it sounds like in English. It's like grasping, right? So concept in Latin literally means something that you grasp something with. So, as opposed to a percept, right? So a concept, a Begriff, you're grasping it. There's also the other word, like when you use a concept, you're apprehending something with the mind. You're literally grasping it with your mind. So you're mentally grasping it. That means that it has to be an object, right? So a force or a movement is not something that you can grasp, right? So he's using these terms very literally. Like you can't mentally apprehend or hold in your mind in whatever way a force or a movement with a concept. You can, however, with reason, right? Reason because it's about practice, it's about action, it's about doing, right? So you can relate to a phenomenon that has the appearance of a force by analogy with a practical action that you might do. And that includes the action of the mind, the movement of the mind, the doing of the mind, the mental process itself. What does the cognitive process do? What does it achieve? Right? As an action, not as a thing. But concepts are kind of like things. And this is why we have horrible semiotic nonsense, where we treat concepts as labels that we slap on things. And then it's like, oh, don't label me. That concept doesn't fit. Well, wait, there are other ways of relating to things than that. And concepts are really meant not to just slap a label on, but to really grasp something. So the beautiful is more like the understanding. The beautiful is more like the understanding. It's not reducible to understanding, but it's more like the understanding. Meaning a concept grasps an object the way the experience of the beautiful seems to resolve around an object. An actual object. Now what I'll also say is, remember, there are no objects. In and of themselves, there are no objects. There's only the sensuous manifold, the flux of matter and energy of the universe, out of which we draw things and make into objects. Right? So, in the grand scheme of things, this door stop, these desks, the aluminum and plastic, right? It's all going to be gone. It didn't exist, it won't exist. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't exist. So how does it exist? It exists as a practical and theoretical object. It's a chair that I sit my ass down in. Therefore, it's a chair. I have a concept of a chair. I have a practical action of sitting my ass down in the chair. But otherwise, the chair doesn't exist.
So, Kant was talking about enthusiasm as a sublime.
Is a sublime? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I was confused because didn't he say like we should not choose with the feeling? Enthusiasm is kind of like a process of like make feeling. Is that because the thinking of the process and feeling it is before is considered? That's why it's implement.
Right, so there's a thought that comes from a feeling, and there's a feeling that comes from a thought. Right, that's what he was trying to get at there. Meaning that our thinking can produce a feeling, or our thinking can be produced by a feeling. Now again, the feeling of the sublime is hard to distinguish from the process of mental cognition, or from thinking. So recall the Baudelaire, whether these thoughts spring from things or from myself, unclear, right? Meaning, is the sublime experience in the things or in myself? And exactly that is what Kant's talking about. Meaning, it unlike the appearance of the beautiful, which seems to be about the object, the appearance or the phenomenon of the sublime seems inextricably bound up with our own experience of the thing. And that includes the mental process as well as the feeling, right? So they're kind of more bound to each other. Whereas, so feeling in a more active sense as opposed to feeling about something, where it's more the object. Again, that analytical distinction. So we could say that, and I think that he does say something like this, that we judge something as beautiful as an object, but yeah, he's basically saying it here, but I think he says it somewhere else, that the experience of the beautiful is itself sublime. Right, so the experiencing something as beautiful is itself an example of the sublime.
First time you experience it.
Right, because it's new and different. It doesn't fit an established pattern of either theory or practice. Right, so again, why the aesthetic phenomenon is significant is that it exceeds our capacity to comprehend it, either conceptually or practically. Right, so we're relating to it, the sublime, more as a practical matter, including the practice of our own thinking, the practice of our own cognition. But it still exceeds our ability to fully comprehend that way. Right. And again, that's where we're experiencing our freedom. Because what we're experiencing in the moment of the sublime is our capacity to experience things new and different that we haven't already experienced. So we feel our capacities, the faculties, sort of stretching in the face of a new phenomenon.
I missed this part about it having to be new. Couldn't you have a sublime experience from seeing the same mountain twice? Or is that not?
We'd have a new experience of it. Yeah, that's the newness.
Doing something that you didn't do the first time.
Right. So it's the new and different experience, which is, for Kant, the experience of our own capacity to do something new and different, to to mentally, through cognition, have a new and different experience. And that's why it's freedom. That's why it would be. Mm-hmm.
Sublime experience feel like also a traumatizing experience in a way that I don't know, the way that he described that Kant described the sublime experience is more like the witness of accident, and you can find the humor also in this kind of situation. But I don't know if sublime can be also like witness of car crash, car accident on the highway.
So as a weakness, is that what you said?
Witness.
Oh, witness.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that, again, we're in the realm of apperception, where we're experiencing our own experience, right? And so, again, it's a reflective judgment rather than a determinate judgment. So that would also be true of the sublime as well as the beautiful, meaning it isn't immediate, but is mediate. It's mediated. And I think in that respect, again, something strikes us as beautiful, something strikes us as sublime. It doesn't just sort of pattern recognition compute as this is beautiful, this is sublime. It has to sort of strike us as such. And what we're experiencing, he thinks, also with the beautiful, but especially with the sublime, is the activity of our own subjectivity. And that's why it's really a matter of the forces. So when he describes the sublime, because we've kind of skipped over that part, the force of the phenomenon is met by the force of our own subjectivity. So we experience our own subjectivity as a force. as a dynamic force that is able to meet the phenomenon, not be overwhelmed by it. Now, one example would be a storm. We can experience a storm as sublime, meaning fearful and not terrifying, meaning you can experience a storm as terrifying, meaning it can kill you. It can physically overwhelm you. He's talking about our capacity not merely to resist physically being overwhelmed, mentally overwhelmed. So even though the storm could physically overwhelm you, mentally it doesn't. You're able to enjoy, have a pleasant, pleasing experience of witnessing the storm coming upon you.
Does the phenomenon of it happen before the logic of it has time to act?
Well, I don't know if it's exactly that psychology of it. I think it's more like, again, the wanderer above the sea of fog. There's like
Feeling of it is greater
than the physical threat of it, right? In other words, there's a kind of like courage to the subjectivity that is able to and it's not that you can physically overwhelm the storm. You can't. It might kill you, but the question is, why would we ever feel pleasure in the face of something that could literally kill us? Well, because we process it in this way, as a sublime experience. And then we have to analyze the feelings involved in that. Right, so again, he's interested in explaining experiences that he thinks we all have that can't be explained any other way, that can't be explained by the faculties of understanding or of reason. Right, that can't be explained logically in terms of a determinacy, nor does the random accident seem to be true to our experience of it. Our experience of it, there seems to be something more coherent. There seems to be a reality to the subject. I think that I might have mentioned that early on, and I want to emphasize that. You could say, what is the purpose of Kant's argument? To establish the indubitable reality of the subject. And that's why I know Lacan. Subject's not an illusion, it's real.
Isn't part of the experience of this one that, or like an essential part of it, that it causes this experience of the limits of our subjectivity, and that limit also presents this possibility, which is, at least in the moment foreclosed, but exhilarating in that. That's the freedom, right? Okay.
Right, so that's the other kind of necessity-freedom dialectic, is that the experience of the limit is actually the experience of the capacity to transcend the limit. But you can't have the experience of transcending the limit unless you experience it as a limit. Right, so you are experiencing the limit of the understanding, or the limit of practical reason. But you're also transcending it in experiencing the limit itself. And that's why it's a threshold experience. Right? It's a threshold experience. So you're sort of walking up to the threshold and you're peering over the threshold. And you might not literally be crossing the threshold, but you're having the experience of the possibility of crossing the threshold of understanding and practical reason.
Well, and not just crossing in terms of exceeding, but there's a conversion from quantity to quality.
Yeah. Transforming. Right, so that, again, it's not, and if you recall from earlier in the class when I said living form, the challenge is living form. How do we experience form as not dead, but alive, right? Which would seem to be a paradox. And yet, what we're going to get into next week with the teleological beings, what defines a life form is that it is a form. In other words, having a form does not contradict being alive. And yet when we look at the life form as merely a form, then it appears dead. Then it becomes the taxidermy stuffed animal. Right? And that doesn't mean that the living animal doesn't have form, however. And so it challenges our very notion of what form is. And again, this is one step along the way in getting there, in describing the sublime experience as a way of experiencing form at the threshold of formlessness. Right? So again, it's kind of at what threshold does the formless achieve a form, but not as an object, but as a force. Right, so if you recall, he also said, it's something that he'll bring up again, so the storm, and is the storm like a thing? Is it an object, right? It isn't, right? It's more of a kind of combination of forces that seem to come together. Next time we'll see that it's like a dust devil, you know? Is it alive? No. Why? Because it's evanescent, but living things are also evanescent. And yet, so it seems to have a kind of self-organization, and yet it doesn't seem to have a self-organization. It seems to be an organization determined externally rather than internally.
It's an interesting example. I was just reading in a completely different context recently about like the incredible trouble that clouds gave to like Renaissance seeing, like with the introduction of perspective. It was like the one thing that couldn't be like subsumed in this like regime of vision. And so they kind of just like never systematized it. That's why every painter's clouds look totally different, even though all their architecture is.
Because they're not quite geometrical.
Yeah, there's no way to spatialize it in terms of perspective.
Right. Right. And again, that would be the charming, like the example of clouds is precisely the kind of example of like something that allows for the free play of the imagination and yet isn't really a beautiful object and yet does sort of evoke our aesthetic capacities, but doesn't achieve a form. Or when it achieves a form, we realize that it's a kind of a rough approximation of a form. That gets us to another point before we end, which is the mathematical, right? The mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime, and how mathematics in and of itself has a sublime character, because it's kind of like this kind of formal system for judging phenomena, and yet we know that like real things don't really correspond to mathematical principles, and so that attempt to grasp things mathematically is one form of the sublime, but it doesn't exhaust the notion of the sublime, because then we need more of a sense of the dynamically sublime. So when we try to contemplate very small things or very large things, when we kind of try to mathematize infinity, you know, that gives us, like when we're thinking about it, that gives us a kind of sublime experience. When we try to extrapolate from ordinary space, the size of the Earth, right? So even when we're like looking at like the horizon and the curvature of the Earth, when we try to contemplate the actual size of the Earth, it becomes a kind of sublime experience. Right, so again, the difference between the mathematical and the dynamic sublime is not like two different things, but rather where does it cross the threshold of being able to hold something in your imagination mathematically, in which case you're doing it conceptually, versus aesthetically, in which case you're doing it more dynamically, and in which the attempt to grasp things mathematically is itself an example of that kind of mental action that is characteristic of the sublime. Right. Another way of putting it is a computer can tell us the size of the Earth in a very exact mathematical calculation, but the computer will never have an experience of the size of the Earth as sublime.
I think that's an interesting example, because like, I feel like in Kant's time, maybe like the size of the Earth was just this like incomprehensible, like, you know, enormity or whatever. But like, I don't know, I've driven from like New York to LA, like I can kind of wrap my head around 3,000 miles, 6,000 miles, you know, it doesn't necessarily.
So check this out, ancient civilizations actually had accurately calculated the size of the Earth just through observation. Right? They were able to do that. Multiple civilizations.
But even in that, they're like taking a portion of it in order to understand the whole. You're not understanding the whole as a
Sure, but wouldn't the same be true of like a walk in my neighborhood, right? Like I don't see the whole neighborhood, right?
Again, if we keep in mind like the subjectivity, its reality, what makes it possible, how we experience ourselves, right? How we experience our own subjectivity, and ultimately how we don't do so as a static proposition, but as an ongoing open-ended proposition, right? So Yeah, so I pointed out ancient peoples were able to calculate the size of the Earth. Well, but we didn't stop there either, right? And we can have a different kind of aesthetic appreciation of like size, volume, space, etc. And mathematics also has continued to develop, even to the point of non-Euclidean geometry, right? So we now have mathematical forms that don't correspond to our empirical experience of space.
Theoretical, physics.
That's right, theoretical physics. So in other words, in non-Euclidean geometry and theoretical physics, that might actually be the object, right? In which case, like how can you describe a black hole in three-dimensional space? Actually, you can't. And yet, we can cognize it. Right, so again, it's not sense data perception, it's not empirical. It's cognitive. Right. Okay, see you next week.